Hey everyone, today I want to talk about the notion that D&D 4th edition made every class a spellcaster. For as long as I have been playing the game, I've heard this complaint and it deserves some investigation. Let's take a look at exactly what it means to be a spellcaster, how this differs from other types of classes, how the classes were implemented in 4th edition, and then address whether this complaint has any merit. If you want to support the channel, please check out some of the links down in the description. Before we can hope to reach a conclusion, we need to make sure we understand the complaint itself. I went through the comments I've received over the past several months and found some trends with regard to this topic. When someone says that 4th edition made every class a spellcaster, the criticism is usually accompanied by a couple of assertions. First, the mechanics that spellcasters use are the same as those used by non-spellcasters, therefore everyone is basically a spellcaster. And the other assertion is that non-casters are able to do things in 4th edition that only a magic user should be able to do, therefore again, everyone is basically a spellcaster. Let's dig into it and see if either of these statements hold true. First, what exactly is a spellcaster? In D&D terms, a spellcaster is a character that obtains magical energy from some source and then channels that energy to perform wonderful things. A cleric gets their energy from their devotion to a deity, druids get it from their connection to the natural world, wizards get it from their meticulous study of ancient texts, warlocks get it from a pact they've made with another being, and there are many other connections as well. All of this magical energy is then focused into spells that the character can cast to do different things. Mechanically, in D&D 3rd edition and 5th edition, spellcasting uses a system with two main types of spells. First, there are cantrips that can be cast as many times per day as the character desires. For all other spells, the character has a number of spell slots available to them. Casting such a spell uses up a corresponding slot for that day. As they level up, the character gets access to new spells and additional spell slots. There are also a few differences in how the characters learn spells and what they can prepare to cast each day. For instance, a cleric has a list of known cleric spells. When they choose to cast a spell, they can choose any spell that they know. A wizard, however, must prepare their spells. They have a spell book with a vast set of different spells that they've learned, but each day they must explicitly prepare a limited number of them. If they have not prepared a spell for that day, then they cannot cast that spell on that day. There are also rituals that are special spells that take a long time to cast. There are slightly different rules for those. And some spellcasters may actually be able to wield weapons that they use in addition to their spells. At their core, a spellcaster is a class whose primary abilities come from their talent at using magical energy to cast spells. Now we have an idea of what a spellcaster is. How exactly does this differ from what other classes can do? Well, at the other end of the spectrum are the martial classes, like barbarians and fighters and monks. These are characters that primarily use weapons or their bare fists to accomplish their goals. These classes get access to a few special abilities that they can use, like Fists of Fury or Rage or Sneak Attack. They can typically use these abilities a limited number of times each day. As they level up, they get access to new abilities. Depending on the options selected for the character, some of them might actually get to do some spellcasting as they level up, but this is usually secondary to their brute force abilities. In short, non-spellcasters are those classes whose primary abilities come from some sort of physical training. As you might expect, there are a lot of classes and subclasses that live in the gray area between these two extremes. So what was so different about 4th edition? Well, the spellcasting classes still got their energy from some source. Clerics had devotion to a deity, warlocks made pacts with otherworldly beings, wizards studied ancient tomes. They could then channel this energy to cast their spells. So far, it's very similar to what we have in 3rd edition and 5th edition and even other editions. But what about the mechanics? Anyone that hangs around 4th edition enough will quickly realize that 4th edition was all about powers. All those spells that I've mentioned before were rolled into powers. They were still called spells in many cases, but they took the standardized format of a power that looked very different from 3rd edition or 5th edition. And the different class features for the martial classes now also took the form of powers that got their energy from the character's commitment to martial training. So we had both spellcasters and non-spellcasters with powers that were formatted in the same style, and both types of classes now had a defined energy source for those powers. To someone paging through the player's handbook, it would look like every class had nothing but these powers. On top of this, how these powers were used was also standardized across all the classes. Spell slots were no longer a thing for casters in 4th edition. Each character got access to a set of at-will powers that they could use as much as they liked, plus they had encounter powers that could be used once per encounter, and daily powers that could only be used once per day. Fighters had powers, clerics had powers, wizards had powers, every single class had powers, and mostly followed the same rules for how they could use those powers. But there was a little bit more nuance to it than that. While all classes had powers, there were still differences that made each one special. Barbarians did get access to Rage, and Rogues got access to Sneak Attack. Wizards also still had a spell book that they could add powers to. They would then prepare a list of those powers for use each day, much like how they prepared spells in the other versions. Wizards also got access to a number of cantrips that they could cast as many times as they liked. But overall, from a mechanics perspective, 4th edition powers definitely made the classes look similar. What about substance? The other assertion was that non-spellcasters were now able to do things that seemed magical. And some of this might be supported by the fact that the player's handbook said that martial classes had martial energy that gave them abilities beyond those of ordinary mortals. But I looked through the player's handbooks and the martial powers books for 4th edition, and honestly I could not find a lot of examples of martial powers crossing the line into being magical. Most of the non-spellcaster powers allowed for extra movement or extra damage or pushing another creature, all things that seemed fitting for a martial class and similar to the things that those classes can do in the other versions of the game. I'll talk about a few of the exceptions a little later. As best I can tell, in 4th edition there is still a pretty clear line between what spellcasters and non-spellcasters can do. Cleric prayers included effects that did healing and provided a bonus to allies. Wizard spells included the things that you would expect, like Magic Missile and Flaming Sphere and Jump. Warlocks got Eldritch Blast. Paladins got various forms of Smite. Meanwhile, fighters got access to Cleave, while rangers got Hunter's Quarry. Rogues got Sneak Attack and also trained in more skills than the other classes. With few exceptions, the powers available to each class seem to align with the nature of that class and the sorts of things that we've seen in other editions. So where does that leave us? After looking at the mechanics and the substance of the game, did Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition make all classes spellcasters? Honestly, I don't think so. With regard to the mechanics, it is true that all the classes in 4th edition used basically the same system for their powers, but I think this was actually one of the advantages of 4th edition. It made it really easy to make any character you wanted because the creation process was so similar, and then playing the characters was also much simpler because how you used the powers was mostly the same regardless of what kind of character you were playing. There was very little learning curve for the different classes. Once you knew how to play one type of character, you could basically build any other as well. When it comes to the mechanics, it isn't that 4th edition made all the classes spellcasters, it's just that they came up with better rules that were easier to learn and play no matter what class you selected. In reality, every edition of Dungeons & Dragons brings with it a new set of mechanics for how you play the characters. 4th edition was no different. And these standardized rules in no way meant that all the characters were the same. The specific things that the classes did, the flavor text provided with each power, and the personality given to the characters by the players was definitely just as varied as in other editions. I mean, after all, in 5th edition, there are tons of different abilities that allow you to roll with advantage or add a d4 to a result, but it is the flavor that those abilities have for each class and what the player does with them that makes them special. The same was true in 4th edition. As for the substance, I mentioned that I only found a few instances where non-spellcasters had a power that seemed magical. For example, the level 12 rogue power Impossible to Catch allows the character to become invisible until the start of your next turn. And there were a couple warlord powers that allowed allies to get temporary hit points or spend a healing surge. I could see these being things that would require magic. But if we're willing to accept that a wizard has some sort of energy based on their study of ancient tomes in a library and that enables them to perform magical feats, why is it so hard to extend that and say that a fighter that spends their entire life in pursuit of martial excellence would also be able to do incredible things? And just like they can do in 5th edition and 3rd edition, maybe those characters also learned how to channel some inner magic to do those more fantastical things as they leveled up. D&D is, after all, a game where heroic characters do amazing things. These special abilities have existed in the game for many years. 4th edition simply took it to the next level and said, let's make all the classes cool and let's do it in a way that's easy for everyone to pick up and learn. Did 4th edition make all the classes spellcasters? By the simplest interpretation of the mechanics, I suppose you could look at it that way. Is that a bad thing? Quite the opposite. 4th edition powers gave all the characters really cool things that they could do. The standardized rules made all the characters easy to create and play. The rules still allowed each player to bring their character to life with the personality that they chose. In short, 4th edition did what every version of Dungeons & Dragons strives to do. It made all the characters fun. Please subscribe to the channel and let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time, take care.